Policy and modeling and simulation. How modeling and simulation influences and is influenced by policy. My name is Ashley Duncan Buss. I'm an AI policy advisor for healthcare and guest contributor to the Healthcare Modeling and Simulation Certificate at NPS. Most of your coursework has focused on how to manage modeling and simulation facilities. This module really encourages students to look at the broader capabilities of modeling and simulation. By the end of this module, you'll be able to recognize and advocate for modeling and simulation as a policy relevant decision tool, position modeling and simulation within the healthcare policy lifecycle, communicate simulation insights responsibly, communicating uncertainty, assumptions, limitations, and constraints, and proactively anticipate and craft governance frameworks for your own simulation facilities. This module explores the dual relationship between modeling and simulation in healthcare policy. On the one hand, modeling and simulation generates decision relevant insight that can inform and strengthen policy decisions. And on the other hand, policy frameworks determine how modeling and simulation is developed, governed, implemented, and interpreted. We're going to start with the first one, policy informed by modeling and simulation. If we say that modeling and simulation can inform policy, we have to ask ourselves, what exactly does it produce that's useful? Most people think of modeling and simulation as just a training tool, but what it actually produces is substantive and reliable data, not just completion rates or pass or fail outcomes, but performance data. We can see error patterns, observe workflow, measure cognitive load in high stress scenarios, analyze team coordination dynamics, simulate cost implications. We can forecast capacity under different staffing models. This output can all serve as input to policy decisions. These methods offer an opportunity to test policy theories without wasting precious resources, time, or risking adverse effects. Ideally, several alternative policy proposals would be explored in parallel, compared, and refined before large financial investments were made or patients were exposed to unnecessary risk. Modeling and simulation through various simulations and models makes several things visible to inform policy. First, simulation makes system interdependencies visible. Healthcare systems are not isolated. Staffing decisions affect patient flow affects workload, and workload affects safety. Safety affects cost, and so on and so on. Simulation allows us to map and observe how these parts interact rather than evaluating decisions in isolation. We can also isolate different parts and see how the changes play out in the system as a whole. Second, it surfaces downstream and unintended effects. A reimbursement change might improve efficiency, but it could also increase burnout. Simulation allows us to see ripple effects before they materialize. Third, it shows impact over time. Policies often look effective in the short term, but what happens in 6 months, 1 year, or 10 years? Simulation allows us to observe trajectories. Finally, it forces us to confront trade-offs under defined assumptions. Every model operates under assumptions. By defining those assumptions clearly, we can compare options transparently, not based on intuition, but on structured experimentation. Now let's make the link between the output that modeling and simulation creates and how that serves as input into policy decision making. Say that your simulation center has findings of skill degradation after 6 months, or improved surgical outcomes after quarterly refreshers, or reduced ICU errors after team-based sim drills. This can all serve as input into decision making. Things like state recertification intervals, hospital credentialing policy, staffing ratios, scope of practice decisions, and funding allocation. Your facility is actually a policy laboratory. With all of the potential that modeling and simulation has to inform policy, there are still limitations, and we have to be aware of them and communicate them clearly. Modeling and simulation is not a glass ball. It's not a 100% certain look into the future. Models in simulation are representations of the real world and cannot substitute it. Models are also only as strong as the input from subject matter experts. Choosing the right model and area of focus also affects the output and conclusions that are made based on that. The validation determines credibility. And using this output for policy information must be done in conjunction with other methods. It's not a standalone solution. And lastly, communicating results is crucial. Continuing on the point of clear stakeholder communication, I'm going to talk a little bit more about stakeholder and ecosystem awareness. Highly detailed models capture complex trade offs and can communicate a lot, but it can also overwhelm decision makers. So, when we're selecting our models, we really have to keep our audience in mind and think about that when we're choosing the level of fidelity. When you're communicating the results to your stakeholders, we really need to make the assumptions and limitations of our models explicit in our communication. And lastly, inclusion and collaboration increase validity and adoption. So when we're operating in the ecosystem, we really need to be mindful of power dynamics, collaboration, and different mental models, and really think about not only the sophistication of the models that we use, but also on the shared understanding that they create across disciplines. Now let's talk about where modeling and simulation fits in the policy development lifecycle. It's actually valuable throughout the entire process. So before we even begin with policy development, it's helpful during the system mapping and problem framing phase to get all of the right stakeholders at the table and define the problem together. Once you've defined the problem, you can hypothesize over different policy solutions. And you can test options before any real world policy is enacted. After policy is rolled out, it's of course great to use these systems to evaluate the effectiveness of policies. These methods can also be used for continuous recalibration over time. Now we return to that dual relationship I mentioned at the beginning. We've talked about how policy can be informed by modeling and simulation output. Now let's talk about how policies govern modeling and simulation, how it's developed, and how it's used. If you are managing a simulation center, you are setting the standards in modeling and simulation. You decide when simulation can be used for performance checks, how to define the cost and benefit for business cases, and which levels of simulation are appropriate. The usability and impact of the results from your simulation center are directly related to the trustworthiness and credibility of the process. This is where the importance of policies governing the development and use of modeling and simulation comes in. Policies governing modeling and simulation include both decisions you own and shared policy domains. I like to see this in two different columns. On the left, you see decisions you own. This is where you really have the authority to make decisions, and these are issues unique to modeling and simulation. Something such as deciding the level of simulation that's appropriate for a given purpose. These are truly unique to modeling and simulation, and this is really your domain. On the right side, you see shared policy domains. This is really where you have the responsibility to educate yourself in terms of what's already out there and to collaborate with the owners of these domains. The key for you really is to identify where you need to be a thought leader and where you need to align and leverage broader institutional initiatives. This clarity is really going to help you to decide where you can champion standards yourself and where you can collaborate and work with others with similar goals. In terms of defining policies for your own facility, luckily you don't have to start from scratch. There are existing modeling and simulation policies, and one of them includes the Department of Defense Modeling and Simulation Handbook. So leverage these as a place to start, but also to maintain consistency with the broader community. We began by examining how simulation informs healthcare policy, and then we explored the inverse, how policy determines the reach and legitimacy of simulation. You are not just a simulation center. You are shaping whether and how insight enters policy. You are designing the conditions that determine simulation's credibility, influence, and impact.